For many years, the Kremlin has been waging a hybrid war against Europe, interfering in elections, provoking mass unrest, and undermining the foundations of democracy. Against the backdrop of Russia's war against Ukraine, tensions are rising in the Baltic region. Large-scale cyber attacks, border storms by migrants, GPS signal jamming, and recruiting criminals for sabotage. These are just some of the hybrid warfare methods Russia uses against the Baltic countries. The Kremlin is targeting critical infrastructure that connects Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania with the rest of Europe. And the Baltic Sea has been turned into the perfect arena for sabotage operations. What is the real cause of the accident in the Baltic Sea? Why have hybrid operations become Russia's main tool? And why have the Baltic countries come under the brunt of the Kremlin's hybrid attacks?
Hybrid warfare has been studied very seriously and for a long time in Russia, and at a scientific level at that. They have gone far beyond just planning military or intelligence operations. They are already working this out at the level of academic research, essentially elevating this doctrine to the status of a central doctrine for lobbying, let's say, yes, the geopolitical position of the Russian Federation as a whole. Moreover, every year, the range and variety of these methods and tools only continues to expand. For example, let's take Estonia. Yes, specifically in terms of hybrid threats, yes, regarding the Baltic countries. In Estonia, the level of digitalization is 95%. And the mayor of the city, he and I are sitting in the lobby of one of Kiev's hotels discussing issues of cooperation. And right in front of me, he says, "Look, I'm signing the corresponding decision for my municipality right now." Moreover, in Estonia specifically, physical signatures are prohibited because they can be susceptible to corruption. When it comes to electronic signatures, when the database is fully verified, the level of possible manipulation or corruption is also, well, reduced almost to zero. Cool, right? It is cool, but there's a catch. All of this is very open, transparent, anti-corruption, and clear. But when our motivation was to reduce the amount of paperwork and move everything to digital, we faced another problem: cyber attacks from the Russian Federation. Russia will look for opportunities. For Russia, if you create unified electronic databases and don't protect them properly, it's a Klondike, an El Dorado. Basically, you couldn't ask for anything better. Why bother bribing some officials somewhere in the cabinet of ministers in some ministries? What's the point of all that? You can just do all of it from a single portal.
Hybrid operations increased in 2022 after the start of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine. The Baltic Sea became the arena for Moscow's confrontation with Europe, serving as one of the key communication hubs for a number of countries. Undersea cable communication lines there are used not only for military purposes, but also in the economic sphere. The geography of the Baltic region as a distinct part of Europe is convenient for Russia to conduct hybrid operations.
If we are talking about the hybrid threats from the Soviet Federation specifically in this region, we need to understand, why does communication through the Baltic Sea exist at all? Gas communication, electricity communication, communication of communication nodes, almost everything that provides connectivity for the Baltic countries and for Finland as well with Europe. Why do we say with Europe? Why do we separate them, right? So in general, maybe someone would ask that question. The answer is simple: because of the Kaliningrad region. That's the issue. Laying such channels through the Baltic Sea is much, well, cheaper. But probably the key reason, which many people are silent about, or maybe they just don't know, is that everyone is still afraid of a possible breakthrough of a land corridor to the Kaliningrad region. At the same time, it seems to me that Putin will still play the Kaliningrad card for a whole range of reasons. Not even because he wants to, but because essentially now, with the latest wave of NATO expansion, Sweden and Finland, yes, and now, in fact, the Baltic Sea basin is, well, basically a NATO basin. So it's not that their ultimate goal is to break through a corridor to the Kaliningrad region, but rather they need it in order to influence and destabilize the entire region. The Baltic countries, the Nordic countries, and from there, basically Central Europe. Poland is not far, and Germany as well.
Russia is actively studying Europe's weak points, and the Baltic Sea has turned out to be ideal for carrying out sabotage. It is relatively shallow and is crossed by crucial lines of communication between NATO member countries. The undersea cables in the Baltic Sea are the backbone of energy, as well as military and economic communication in the region. Russia has free access to the sea from several ports, and its commercial vessels freely operate in international waters.
Russia needs open and secure lines of communication across the Baltic Sea. That's precisely why essentially they are doing everything they possibly can to secure these vital routes in one way or another. The Russians began looking for ways to influence in the long term the situation in the Baltic region, both the military and possibly the economic situation, by other means, these so-called hybrid methods. And for this, they had a very well-developed tool at their disposal. It's called GUGI, the main directorate of deep sea research. This is a special classified division that reports to the Russian Ministry of Defense, established back in the 1960s. Its primary task is to meticulously carry out extensive underwater descents and diligently search for various significant objects underwater that might be of considerable interest. These important items include sensitive hydrophones, crucial underwater cables, vital pipelines, essential communication cables, and any other specialized equipment that might be of particular interest or relevance. In general, GUGI personnel are trained for such underwater operations at depths of up to 6 kilometers. And for this, they have special equipment, which is based on the Kola Peninsula, where these underwater cables are located, and you can even find them on the internet. How can the exact location be further investigated? This, in fact, can be done using a regular, well, not exactly regular, but a pretty good digital fish finder at depths of 200 to 400 meters, which might cost a few $1,000s. And the task is solved. Well, plus, these countries really aren't just raw material appendages like Russia, where, let's say, from 36 to 52% of GDP and their budgets come from oil products. For them, it's mainly services, IT products, and engineering. All this information is transmitted. Business is conducted precisely through these cables, including information transfer. They see this, identify these kinds of critical vulnerabilities, and they act. It basically costs nothing.
On the night of October 8, 2023, the operators of the Baltic Connector gas pipeline recorded a sharp drop in pressure in the system. It was later revealed that the Chinese vessel New Polar Bear, which had departed from St. Petersburg, dropped anchor and severed the pipeline between Finland and Estonia. The 77-kilometer main pipeline runs through the Gulf of Finland and a part of the Baltic Sea, extending up to Russian territorial waters. Then a series of accidents occurred, all sharing a number of similar details. On November 15, 2024, another Chinese vessel departed from the Russian port of Ust-Luga. 3 days later, the Finnish state data transmission provider reported a malfunction in the cable between the Finnish capital Helsinki and the German port of Rostock. A few hours later, the CTO of a Lithuanian telecommunications company announced a break in the undersea internet cable connecting Lithuania to the Swedish island of Gotland. It was later revealed that this Chinese vessel had passed near the communication lines in the Baltic Sea at approximately the same time the damage was discovered. And in December, the Wall Street Journal, citing anonymous sources, reported that Russian intelligence had ordered the ship's captain, who turned out to be Russian, to cut the cables using the anchor.
Various European media outlets have somewhat different interpretations of the events. Some initiate criminal cases, then some people come out and say that no, this or that Chinese vessel apparently had nothing to do with the cable damage. But as for the presence of a Russian Federation trace there, personally, I have no doubt about it. It looks more like preparation. It looks more like a scenario test. What do I mean by that? If the power cable is cut, then the Baltic countries, their generation, their electricity generation capacity will not be enough to meet their needs. So if you theoretically plan, including cutting off gas as well, right? In other words, you cut off communications, you cut off gas, you cut off electricity all at once. Then, for example, if some Russian special operation is planned for nighttime, will the internal generation be able to cover all the needs of the Baltic countries? Most likely no. There you go. And after that, it becomes a matter of combinations. Next comes a combination of hybrid factors and threats, which can be carried out simultaneously through this very hub. We've already discussed it, the Baltic Sea, primarily targeting the Kaliningrad region. As I see it, this is exactly what the Russian Federation is currently testing right now. They are thoroughly testing various security tools, essential logistics tools, and crucial tools for economic interaction between the European countries that pass through the strategically vital Baltic Sea region.
In December 2024, there was another accident. This time, the target was the East Link 2 underwater high-voltage power cable, which connects the power systems of Finland and Estonia. Finnish special services managed to catch a vessel involved in the incident red-handed. Moreover, the oil tanker Eagle S turned out to be one of the vessels belonging to Russia's so-called shadow fleet. The possible sabotage was carried out using a well-practiced method. The Eagle S tanker, registered in the Cook Islands with a Russian crew, tore the interconnector with its anchor.
The shadow fleet of Russia is just slang. It's not some kind of, let's say, official term, like, for example, the Russian Navy. That's an organization recognized worldwide, and it has an affiliation. If a Russian Navy ship commits some illegal act, then the Russian Federation as a state is held responsible for it. That's it. But if a tanker from this so-called Russian shadow fleet does something, it's very, very hard to prove anything. It's difficult to establish any connection between the actions of this tanker and the Russian state. Why is that? Because this tanker sails under the flag of a country other than Russia. It usually belongs to an offshore company, not to Russia. The only thing that's Russian there, so to speak, well, aside from maybe part of the crew, is the oil. Because the oil was loaded at this Baltic port, and it's very easy to prove by its chemical composition that it's Russian oil. There was that outrageous incident when this tanker, as it was approaching the area of the East Link cable, simply lowered its anchor chain down to a depth close to the seabed. It didn't drag the anchor chain. When passing near this cable, you can simply, well, drop it sharply, and thanks to the kinetic impact of this multi-ton machine, you can actually cut through or just crush the cable. So this was a very well-planned operation. And in general, it's not normal when the anchor chain, or rather the anchor itself, is not secured in its designated place, but is instead lowered even above the water level. It's important to prove that this captain, who was in charge of the ship and the crew, was performing certain manipulations with the anchor chain, and that this was done, let's say, consciously, deliberately, and on whose orders?
Russia is doing everything it can to maintain energy control over the region where the Kaliningrad region is located. But despite the difficult situation, in February 2025, the Baltic countries disconnected from the Russian power grid, thereby strengthening their sovereignty. However, the threat of new sabotage in the region is only growing.
If we talk about, for example, the variety of such hybrid threats, let's say in the direction of the Kaliningrad region from the Russian Federation through the territory of Belarus, we can model, well, obviously this is nothing more than, let's say, a simulation. And this is nothing more than, let's say, the result of analyzing actions previously carried out by the Russian Federation. But it seems to me that, after all, the functions assigned to the North Koreans, whom the Russian Federation is currently using, are much broader. Some were sent, let's say, to Donbass and so on. But again, there's a rather questionable aspect to this, because they are out of sync, and after all, they speak different languages. In other words, the North Koreans need a very narrowly defined role in order to be used. In this particular case, they found this narrow function in the Kursk region. But I absolutely do not rule out that, for example, when the level of synchronization between the North Koreans and Russian troops increases, and it already has, let's call things by their proper names, and another wave of manpower arrives, well, why couldn't they implement such a scenario of another hybrid threat from the Russian Federation, for example, to break through the Suwałki corridor to the Kaliningrad region? With whose help? That's right, with the help of the North Koreans. Yes, of course, one way or another, Russia will be blamed afterwards. But Russia will say, wait a second, who was fighting? The North Koreans. So go ahead and declare war on North Korea. What's the problem? Or, for example, where did they come from? From Russia? No, from Belarus. And Belarus is a separate country, a separate state. You see what I mean? So hybrid wars are about covering your tracks, obscuring direct investigative links to yourself, and finding loopholes, and this is very important, finding loopholes in international law. That is, hybrid warfare itself, the elements and tools of hybrid warfare very often exploit loopholes, for example, in the United Nations Charter. They use, as it were, democratic platforms, such as the UN General Assembly, the UN Security Council, of which the Russian Federation is a member, for their manipulative purposes, and in order to implement, confirm, or amplify the level of hybrid threats.
Russia is testing the Baltic countries' ability to defend their borders in various ways. And this trend emerged even before the full-scale invasion. Military exercises, the transfer of large numbers of soldiers and heavy equipment from the Russian Federation to Belarus and the Kaliningrad region, all of this was never concealed. On the contrary, it was widely showcased to the world in news reports. Kremlin propaganda regularly portrays the Baltic states as warmongering Russophobes. Armies of internet trolls and bots on social networks promote pro-Russian narratives. In addition, the Kremlin actively uses the Russian-speaking minority in the Baltic countries to sow internal discord.
All scenarios of hybrid threats, in this case, the Russian Federation will try to implement simultaneously. That's why now, indeed, Russian enclaves are under serious scrutiny in the Baltic countries. We clearly understand that there are settlements, for example, in Estonia, where the population is 90 or even 80% Russian-speaking. It is precisely these territories that are under the greatest influence from the hybrid threats of the Russian Federation. Let me return to your previous points. Does the Russian Federation really need to use, for example, direct military force to obtain some kind of enclave, say, in hypothetical Estonia? Why? No, they don't. All they really need is to have, among the Russian-speaking population, which has been gradually integrating there for years, intelligence operatives, sleeper agents, who through horizontal network connections, and there are a lot of different kinds of networks now, including, by the way, religious ones like the UOCMP and so on, or their equivalents, can operate. So their task could be very simple: to gather a large group with intelligence operatives at its core and, for example, hold peaceful demonstrations along the main streets of the cities they need, including, if necessary, the capitals, and then perhaps simply surround, by joining hands, say, NATO bases, forming a human chain to prevent a single tank from leaving. For this, there is no need to involve planes, tanks, or helicopters. Nothing at all is needed. Essentially, the life of a particular country is blocked. And now just imagine, if on top of all this, there is some kind of breach of the Suwałki corridor, and at the same time, power, gas, and related communication cables connecting the Baltic countries, let's say with Poland and Germany, are also cut. The level of destabilization that would occur there would be absolutely maximal.
A full-scale Russian invasion of the Baltics in the near future is unlikely. As experts note, the Kremlin does not have the resources for a major war in Europe. The Baltic countries, as NATO's eastern flank, are reinforced by a permanent alliance military contingent. However, hybrid operations are a new threat to the West, one that must be learned to counter.
Hybrid warfare in the Baltics is the biggest challenge we are facing. We are talking about Russia's aggressive behavior. They are trying to disrupt our lives. They are also testing us as an alliance to see how far they can go. Krzysztof Jaworski, Vice Admiral of Poland.
In January, 8 NATO countries in the Baltic region agreed on a joint action plan to defend the waters from Russian sabotage. The mission, called Baltic Sentinel, involves tracking the routes of ships. At the summit in Helsinki, a decision was made to significantly increase the number of combat boats, reconnaissance aircraft, as well as surface and underwater drones. In addition, submarines and satellites will be involved.
It is possible to establish, let's say, a security perimeter for those same cables, a kind of protective boundary, so that if a vessel or an underwater device maneuvers and crosses this security line, then with a high degree of probability, we can say that something might happen. And at that moment, it becomes possible to implement some countermeasures. This could primarily be some form of counteraction, possibly electronic warfare. That is, we interrupt because any object underwater or above water is controlled. So we immediately disrupt it, but electronic warfare capabilities are very strong in the West. Then, at the very least, documenting what is happening, documenting it, and perhaps possibly deploying some active countermeasure systems. I do not rule out that weapons could be used against such ships and vessels engaged in this kind of activity. And by the way, even in international maritime law, which is considered quite democratic, there are certain instruments for this.
Will this completely solve the problem? No, of course it won't. So what is it, this hybrid war? It's about constantly looking for small gaps in security where you can slip through. And if we talk about the Baltic Sea, it's not just a gap, it's a wide open door. We need to understand why these disruptions are happening. Because most likely, this is a rehearsal for the real thing, right? It's not just, let's say, a desire to mess with some country like Sweden, Denmark, Estonia, or anyone else. No, if someone thinks that, it's a very well simplistic view. This is a test run. Here's a great example. It's like a test drive of a car you might want to buy. You want to try it out, see how it runs, and what consequences this test drive will have for these countries. How quickly can they fix this disruption? What are the consequences in the time between the disruption and when the damage is repaired? What exactly happens? That's why, in reality, Europe now needs to develop an entirely new approach, a new way of making decisions regarding threats to its security. Because essentially many people say, and I share this view, that Russia has already been at war with Europe for quite some time. But the fact that we call it a hybrid war and that we say this war hasn't started, well, that's just legal casuistry. In reality, the war has been going on for a long time, and it's quite a difficult war for Europe. And to turn a blind eye to say it doesn't exist, to hide from it, I think it's already too late for that now. In this sense, the Russian Federation has long since crossed all the red lines, and for it to cross yet another red line, frankly, is no longer a big issue. That's why Macron, Starmer, and Merkel in Germany have become more active now. That's also why Ursula von der Leyen from the European Commission is now trying to call things by their proper names. They put it very simply. If we are not able to consolidate, unite, and fully grasp the level of threats coming from the Russian Federation right now, then at some point, the European Union might simply cease to exist. No one is talking anymore about whether Europe is strong or not. The question is simply whether Europe, as such as a subject of international relations, will remain or not. It's like that choice from the movie The Matrix. That's essentially the decision these countries are facing now. The red pill or the blue pill, right? I think this key understanding is lacking in the so-called Greater Europe. Because, for example, those in Western Europe think it's far away. America thinks, how did Trump put it? They're behind a beautiful ocean, right? Exactly. But in reality, in the era of digital technologies, hybrid threats have reached such a level that neither territory nor distance nor anything else will be an obstacle if the Russian Federation wants to destabilize a particular country or region. That's why, yes, we need to be prepared for this.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.